the fullness of the Gentiles. It is a tried and true verity that if you don't know what people are talking about, you are certainly not going to understand what they say. That has never been more applicable than it is in the case of the things that Paul says in Romans chapter 11. So let me give you a bit of insight into the context in which that chapter occurs. In Romans chapter 9, Paul begins by talking about the fact that the Jews have been cut off from corporate Israel, but that does not mean God has abandoned his intention to fulfill the promise. It just means the Jews who rejected the truth are no longer members of the heir of the promise. He points back to the fact that the promise was handed down by Abraham to Isaac, and Isaac to Jacob, in accordance with God's choice. In both cases, God rejected a potential heir who did not inherit the promise. Such is the case in this instance also. Paul has in mind the fact that Jesus Christ became the heir of the promise when the Jews were cut off from corporate Israel. Therefore, he turns his focus to refuting the argument of those who claim it is not fair to restrict access to the promise to just one man. The essence of what Paul says is, God has the right to choose who does and does not have access to the promise. But he mentions what Hosea says about the Gentiles becoming the people of God, because Hosea prophesied at the time when God cut off the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom from corporate Israel and never restored them. His point is, the same cutting off process resulted in Jesus remaining as the remnant of Israel, and God is now building a house on the very stone that the Jewish leaders ignorantly thought they were cutting off from Israel. In Romans chapter 10, Paul expresses his heartfelt desire that the Jews who have been cut off from corporate Israel would believe that Jesus Christ is the heir of the promise, and accept God's declaration of not guilty by believing God has fulfilled the promise, by raising Christ from the dead. Unfortunately, the Jews have refused to do so. Therefore, God has turned to the Gentiles and is now taking a people for himself, and building a house out of those who respond to the truth. That is the point at which Romans chapter 11 begins. Paul is still focused on the fact that all the Jews have been cut off from corporate Israel, and Gentiles are being grafted into Jesus Christ, the one who became the remnant of corporate Israel, when all the other Jews were cut off from corporate Israel. You need to keep that in mind. It is important. And the reason it is important is because it is absolutely impossible to understand what Paul has in mind when he says all Israel and the fullness of the Gentiles, if you don't know the truth in regard to God viewing corporate Israel as his firstborn son, and Ephraim as the one who was given the honor of carrying the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am going to discuss those things in the next few pages, so that you have a succinct summary of things I have explained in various other places over the past 3 decades. The biblical account begins at the point where it became obvious that Jacob, the heir of the promise, was on his deathbed and had to hand down the promise to the next heir of the promise. Moses tells us that, instead of doing what his father and grandfather had done, Jacob divided up the promise and distributed it to several of his sons. But before that, he did something even more interesting. He passed over his eldest sons, and gave his grandson Ephraim the honor of carrying the name of the 3 men who had most recently been the heir of the promise. Genesis chapter 48, verses 1 through 22, my interim translation. And it happened after these things, it was said to Joseph, "Guess what? Your father is in torment." So he took 2 of his sons with him, Manasseh and Ephraim. When it was told to Jacob, "Guess what? Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel gathered his strength and sat up on the cot. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and he said to me, 'Guess what? I am going to make you bear fruit and become many, and I will turn you into a congregation of peoples, and I will give this land to your seed after you as an eternally burning property. But now 2 of your sons, those who were engendered for you in the land of Egypt until my coming to Egypt to you, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, like Reuben and Simeon. But your kinfolk, the ones that you engendered after them, will be yours. They will be called along with the name of their brothers in their inheritance. But I, while I was coming from Padan, Rachel died on me in the land of Canaan on the way while there was still a good stretch of land to go to Ephrath. So I buried her there on the way. Ephrath is Bethlehem. Then Israel saw the sons of Joseph and said, Who are these? So Joseph said to his father, They are my sons, the ones that God gave me in this land. So he said, Bring them to me, please, so that I may bless them. But Israel's eyes were heavy from old age, he was not able to see. So he brought them close to him and he kissed them and hugged them. Then Israel said to Joseph, I could not pray for seeing your face, but guess what? God has also allowed me to see your seed. Then Joseph made them get away from his knees, and he fell prostrate with his nose to the earth. And Joseph took both of them and brought them close to him, Ephraim with his right hand at Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand at Israel's right hand. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, even though he was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, because Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked continually, the God who has shepherded me from my inception up to this day, the messenger who has redeemed me from everything bad, will bless the boys, and my name will be proclaimed by them, as well as the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, so that they proliferate into a large number in the midst of the earth. When Joseph saw that his father put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it was bad in his sight, so he held the hand of his father fast, to move it from on the head of Ephraim onto the head of Manasseh. And Joseph said to his father, Not so, my father, because this is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know, he also will become a people, and he also will be great. But his younger brother will become greater than he, and his seed will become the fullness of the Gentiles. So he blessed them on that day, saying, Israel will bless by you, saying, May God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh. So he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, Guess what? I am going to die, but God will be with you, and he will bring you back to the land of your fathers. But I have made you one shoulder above your brothers, so that I may take it out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and bow. That is not a feel-good story about how much Jacob loved his son Joseph. It is instead a pivotal point in the biblical history of the promise, and it provides critical insight into why God granted Gentiles the opportunity to be grafted in to corporate Israel. But to understand the biblical history pertaining to the salvation of the Gentiles, one needs to know a few crucial facts about the ancient Hebrew mindset regarding the names of the patriarchs that Jacob gave Ephraim the honor of carrying. 1. The name of a man was considered to be an integral part of the man, just as real a part as his body, soul, and spirit. It reflected the essence of who he was. That is why God changed the name of Abram to Abraham and the name of Jacob to Israel. 2. The ancients believed that, when a man died, he had no hope of resurrection if his name did not have a house, a son, in which it could continue living. That is the unstated point of the story about Tamar and Judah in Genesis chapter 38, and the story about Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth, as well as the law regarding levirate marriage in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. 3. The son who had the honor of carrying the name of his forefathers was the carrier. Since the resurrection and eternal life of the forefathers depended on someone carrying their name, having a son who could carry it after his death was essential. The fact that Jacob gave Ephraim the right to carry the names of the patriarchs became extremely significant in 722 BC, when the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were cut off from corporate Israel at the time of the Assyrian captivity. The tribe of Ephraim was one of those 10 tribes, and Hosea plainly tells us the carrier of the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was scattered throughout the Gentiles when Ephraim got himself all mixed up with them. Hosea chapter 7, verse 8, my interim translation. Ephraim, he will mix himself up with the peoples. Ephraim will become flatbread that has not been turned. If you want to understand how the mystery of the scriptures unravels, you need to know the things I have just told you about the fulfillment of Jacob's prophecy regarding Ephraim becoming the fullness of the Gentiles. When Paul uses the same phrase in Romans chapter 11, verse 25, he is pointing back to what Jacob said to Joseph. But he uses the phrase all Israel in the very next verse, and he does so because he knows it means corporate Israel. So let me explain a bit about what you need to know about corporate Israel.